Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Wall Street Journal's book club discussion of To Kill a Mockingbird and Go Set a Watchman. We're here with our WSJ books reporter, Jen Maloney. Hey, Jen.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So it's been a crazy couple of days in the book world. The first chapter of Go Set a Watchman was published on Friday in the Journal and the Guardian, and then the book came out on Tuesday. Can you describe sort of the atmosphere surrounding this publication?
Sure, it's been a whirlwind, hasn't it? The first big bombshell came on Friday morning when the first chapter was released, and we all discovered something really surprising about Scout's friend Jim. And a lot of people had very strong reactions either way to the first chapter. And then later on that day, there was another even bigger bombshell, and that was about the beloved character Atticus, who so many of us grew up loving and sort of idolizing. And this revelation that in Go Set a Watchman he's depicted as a segregationist made a huge splash. And then through the weekend there was huge anticipation. The novel came out on Tuesday around the world, and since then there's been a huge debate worldwide about this book.
Yeah, I mean, it's been amazing to see in the newsroom and outside. What kind of reactions have you been seeing on Twitter?
Well, I've seen really strong reactions, both pro and con. I've seen a lot of people who say, no, not Atticus, this could not happen, how can you do this to my hero? Parents who named their children Atticus feel heartbroken, or who may name their pets Atticus. On the other hand, it has sparked a lot of interesting discussion, and some people say, you know what, there's value in a book that opens up a discussion about race relations, particularly at a time in our country when we're grappling with events like the Charleston shooting, and we're having a debate about the Confederate battle flag.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, it really adds a whole nother level of complication to an already complicated book. So you wrote an article about the logistics of getting this book into bookstores under this really serious secret embargo. Can you talk to us a little bit about the whole process for getting it out into the world?
Sure. This was a global coordinated release under a very, very strict secretive embargo and on a very tight timeline. The book was released in more than 70 countries around the world simultaneously, midnight local time on Tuesday. That meant that readers in Australia got to peek at it first, and then in London, readers were lined up at midnight to get the book, and then 5 hours later in New York, they were lined up at midnight to get the book. So it was this sort of wave that swept across the world in different time zones. And the secretive nature of it made a lot of sort of logistical complications. For example, Barnes & Noble held the book in its distribution centers in these high security areas under camera surveillance and under lock and key, and then the books from there, from those two distribution centers, went out to stores around the country by truck where they were kept in secure areas, backroom storage, but again, either under lock and key or wrapped with shrink wrap, under camera surveillance. Nobody wanted this book to come out before the release date.
Yeah, I was talking to a few bookstore managers the night that it came out, and one of them in the Harvard bookstore said that they left all the books in the boxes with the orange embargo tape on top, and then they counted down and actually just plunged into it right at the end of the countdown for midnight. The WSJ Book Club has been reading To Kill a Mockingbird over the last several weeks leading up to this release. And we've had a ton of great discussion on the Facebook page. So we just wanted to take a few questions from readers about To Kill a Mockingbird, and then we'll get into questions about Go Set a Watchman. So the first question is from Lorraine Babameadow. She says, was Atticus naive to believe that his children would come to no harm by Mr. Ewell after the threats?
Atticus is the moral center of To Kill a Mockingbird, and one of the sort of tenets of his moral code is empathy. He says that you have to walk in another man's shoes in order to understand him. And he is proved wrong by Mr. Yule, actually, I think. He believes the best in people, and throughout the book, he comments on characters who are kind of despicable, but he gives them the benefit of the doubt. He sometimes excuses their failings. But in the case of Mr. Yule, he doesn't believe that this man is going to follow through on the death threat. And he's wrong about that. And I think it's one of the sort of turning points of the novel, and helps in our understanding of Atticus, that he's not perfect. His judgment isn't always right. And in this case, he has actually imperiled his family by believing the best in someone who's a bad person.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about his moral code as sometimes detrimental to his family. I was sort of struck by that part at the end of the book where, you know, the policeman is basically saying, like, we don't want to press charges, and Atticus is saying, what are you talking about? Of course we would. It was just really striking how moral he could be in that situation.
Well, I think there he was balancing the sort of more the imminent choice to maybe protect his son from criminal charges to a kind of a long-term good for his family, because he says he doesn't want this sort of rumor to hang over his son as he grows up. He doesn't want there to be whispers about him. And so I think when he's trying to weigh that balance, he thinks that in the long run it would be better, even though in the short run it would be pretty traumatic for his son to be accused of, you know, attacking and killing someone. But then that whole sort of moral discussion and debate gets turned upside down when he sort of gradually realizes that it wasn't his son who plunged the knife into Mr. Yule.
That's true. So, Jen, could you just share with viewers how many times you reread this book recently?
So, I mean, like so many of us, I read it when I was young. I don't remember what grade I was in, but probably 8th or 9th grade. And as soon as the announcement came in February that this manuscript had been rediscovered and it was going to be published, I asked my mom if she could find my childhood copy, and so she looked on her bookshelves because she has a lot of my childhood books. She couldn't find it, so I had to buy a new copy, and I read it. So I read it this spring, and then when we were preparing for the WSJ book club, I read it again, and then most recently, like right before the release of Ghost at a Watchman, I was skimming through it one more time, looking at my notes and all the parts that I had highlighted. So I fully immersed myself in the world of the fictional Maycomb. But it's such a wonderful book, and I realized reading it as an adult that it was even better than I had remembered.
Yeah, I had the same experience. I didn't remember it very well from when I read it in middle school. And when I reread it for this release, I was just struck by the craft, actually, like the beginning sentence, and then how it just beautifully lays out the story all the way to the end.
The dialogue really struck me too. It just seems so perfect and so vivid, and it just brings you right there with them. The description, I mean, there are so many things I love about this book.
Absolutely. Okay, here's a question from V. Shanahan. V says, what makes To Kill a Mockingbird different from other books with similar themes? Why is it so much more powerful than other books about courtroom procedure or race or child growing up or small towns?
So there are a lot of special things about this book, but there are two in particular that I think really make it stand out among others. One is the fact that it's narrated by Scout Finch, who gives us a perspective both of a child, but also of a grown person sort of reflecting back on her childhood. And we get to see both, which is so neat because
I love that.
She really is able to inhabit the mind of a 6, 7, 8-year-old and let us see her world through the eyes of a child. But then every once in a while, she'll pull back and she'll give you some perspective with some reflections that should sort of show more insight. So that's one really special thing about this book. Another thing that I think is worth noting is that this is not a courtroom drama novel.
Mhm.
This is a story about a family. And the opening line, which is about her brother, Jim, getting his arm broken, sort of
Mhm.
signals to the reader that this is a story about a family, about her and her brother. And it's about a sort of a childhood trauma, this physical trauma that happens to him. The courtroom drama and the debate over race is embedded in the story. It's an important part of the story, but at its heart, it's a story about a family, and I think that's what makes it so powerful.
Mhm. Yeah, another thing that I loved are just the descriptions of the town. I mean, Maycomb is so vivid in the novel. It's almost like a character, and it just comes to the surface so clearly. And I think that sticks with readers, 10 years after they read it.
Absolutely. And the characters, I mean, they're so original. Atticus and Scout are characters that I think we bring with us from the first time we read it and carry them with us in our hearts.
Yeah. So we have a question that just came in from Ken Carpenter, who's a great book club member.
I can.
Ken says, so did Boo Radley kill Mr. Ewell, or did Mr. Ewell fall on his own knife?
Now you're asking me to give away the mystery. I mean, I think she leaves that open for the reader to decide. But you know, Boo Radley is the mockingbird of the story. Boo Radley is the person who wouldn't harm a flea. This sort of enigmatic ghost who sort of is hovering over the story. And I think the possibility that Boo Radley was the one who saved Atticus's children's life is what convinces him to stay silent and not to, you know, present the narrative that his son may have killed Mr. Ewell.
Yeah, I think he did it. Okay, let's do a question here from Chris Fisher-Keller. Chris says, did Lee want us to see Atticus as an infallible hero? I've often wondered about that, since by the standards of the 1930s, and even the time period when she wrote the novel, he's obviously ahead of his time. When we look through a modern lens, though, he's not perfect.
Well, I think that the Atticus of Mockingbird is not perfect. He's certainly a civil rights hero, but he's not a perfect father. He is described as being kind of aloof, kind of treating his kids with detachment. He doesn't go to their school play. He doesn't bring her to a scout to her first day of school. So he's not a perfect father, and he sometimes expresses empathy, as we've discussed, with some pretty despicable characters. And there's some of his views, of course, when we read them today, seem a little off-key, like when he makes fun of the idea of women serving on juries.
Right.
But I do think it's important to read him in the context of his time, and this is the 1930s, the Depression, and he absolutely is ahead of his time. And I think one of the interesting things now with Go Set a Watchman, it allows us the opportunity to go back and read To Kill a Mockingbird and maybe look more closely. Maybe there are things about him that we didn't notice before. Maybe he is a more complex character than we thought him to be. Maybe we idolize him so much that we didn't really analyze all of his, foibles and warts.
Yeah, because he sort of just became a hero after everyone read that book, and especially the movie, Gregory Peck, who's more heroic than that.
Exactly.
So, okay, here we have a question from Shaviva Friedman. Shaviva says, how does the theme of pride play out in To Kill a Mockingbird? When is it fine and when is it bad?
In Maycomb, pride is, I think, a pretty negative trait. You're not supposed to brag about yourself. Atticus, in particular, doesn't brag about the fact that he's the best shot in town. He seems almost really sheepish about it and really reticent to talk about it. On the other hand, Aunt Alexandra expresses a lot of pride about the Finch family and its heritage. But that's a really interesting sort of sub-theme in the novel because Atticus and Scout both seem to be conflicted about Aunt Alexandra's pride of the Finch family. And I think they feel conflicted because it sort of rings of elitism that makes them uncomfortable. So I think that there's some complex issues here that get sort of, you can tease out from this question.
Yeah, and I think Scout, like Atticus, they're both really interested in the truth of any given social situation. So when Aunt Alexandra is telling these family histories, she's telling the very positive aspects of them. And then Atticus kind of slips in what actually happened, and
Right.
Scout. And I think that is a way of remaining humble, too. Okay, here's a question from Cathy Gevlin. She says, is there another book or books after or even before To Kill a Mockingbird was published that had a similar effect on our social consciousness?
I think it'd be hard-pressed to find another book that has had such a broad impact. And I'll tell you why. There is probably no other book that has been as widely read by American school students than To Kill a Mockingbird. It is assigned in virtually every school system in either the 8th or the 9th grade, sometimes 7th. So this is a book that for decades every student has read. And as a result, today it's a book that so many of us remember and have really strong feelings about. And I think in part that's because we read this book at a time that's really crucial in our sort of intellectual and moral development. So it makes a really big impression on us. And I think that you've seen the result of that in the huge, huge response to the announcement that this book was going to be published, and then to the revelation that Atticus is depicted as a segregationist, and then with the release of the book.
Yeah, I mean, it's been kind of moving to see how many people care so deeply about this book and about Atticus and how attached they are to their image of him as a hero. I just found that really amazing to see during this whole process. So now we sort of transitioned in the book club to reading Go Set a Watchman, and we had some questions from readers about that book. So here's another from Cathy Gevlin. She says, I'm wondering about Harper Lee's father. I recall she once said she wrote To Kill a Mockingbird as a love letter to her father. Was he more like Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird or in Go Set a Watchman?
So this is such an interesting question, and it's one I did some research on. It turns out that her real father, A.C. Lee, was a segregationist in the 1950s. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, he had a lot in common with the Atticus of To Kill a Mockingbird. When he was a young lawyer, A.C. Lee defended a pair of black men who had been accused of murder after a robbery gone wrong. He was appointed by the court to defend them, and he did, and they were convicted and hanged. He also had clashes with the Ku Klux Klan, including one altercation on the street at night that his daughter, Nell Harper Lee, witnessed as a child. So he very much had the sort of the kernel of the Atticus of To Kill a Mockingbird in him. However, in the 1950s, after the Supreme Court ruling of Brown versus Education, A.C. Lee had segregationist views and opposed school integration. What I discovered reading a biography of Harper Lee and speaking with her biographer, was that A.C. Lee changed his views on segregation late in his life. So in the late 50s and early 60s, he changed his mind. He had a change of heart, and he began to advocate for the integration of schools and also for changing the voting districts for better representation for black voters. And it's really interesting to me that as Harper Lee revised her manuscript, as she turned Go Set a Watchman into To Kill a Mockingbird, this was the exact same time in which her father, A.C. Lee, was changing his mind on segregation. And I think that helps us understand how the Atticus of Go Set a Watchman evolved in multiple drafts into the Atticus of To Kill a Mockingbird.
So interesting that she wrote it right after his views changed. That's like such an interesting timeline. So here's another question on Atticus from Greg Bloomquist. Greg says, Atticus is a good lawyer, we agree, but good lawyers do not necessarily agree with their clients or like them. So my question, is the apparent shock at the so-called revelation in Go Set a Watchman due to the actual contrast between the presentation of Atticus in To Kill a Mockingbird and Go Set a Watchman, or to our failure to realize Harper Lee's accurate depiction of Atticus as a good lawyer who will defend a client well in spite of the lawyer's own personal feelings?
I don't think that the Atticus of To Kill a Mockingbird was standing up there speaking about equal rights for all and really inside his mind not believing it. And I have reasons in the text of the novel to believe that. He doesn't just express these views in his closing arguments before the jury, he also expresses them to his kids, Scout and Jem. And he teaches them, you know, equal justice for all, special privileges for none. It's sort of part of his moral code. And so I believe the Atticus Finch of To Kill a Mockingbird, that he believes that the courtroom is a place where we should have equal justice for all. But I do think that it's really an interesting opportunity now, again, with the release of Go Set a Watchman, to read To Kill a Mockingbird more closely and try to understand whether there might have been some more nuances than we realize. Maybe it's possible that a man could believe that black and white people deserve the same standards of justice, but also to have some segregationist views at the same time. And I mean, I can't tell you what the fictional Atticus Finch of To Kill a Mockingbird was thinking, but I think it's an interesting question, and I'm sure there are going to be a lot of new sort of eyes bearing down on the Atticus Finch of To Kill a Mockingbird to see what the text might reveal on a second reading.
Yeah, and it raises some interesting questions, some practical questions for teachers who are teaching To Kill a Mockingbird. We had a couple readers comment on our Facebook page about this. Betsy Pell said, "I'm a retired high school English teacher and department coordinator. I'm very doubtful that I would myself teach any Harper Lee this year. Debate is a valuable study for high schoolers, but the dust has not settled on this yet. It feels too soon to be rushing into the high school classroom with all of this new information." But then we also had another reader, Patricia Donahue, say, "I'm finished and think it well worth the read about Go Set a Watchman. Wish I were back in the classroom again to pair it with To Kill a Mockingbird for classroom discussions." So what kind of response have you been seeing from teachers on this issue?
Well, we've seen a range of responses. There are teachers who, like so many readers, felt heartbroken at the news that Atticus had been depicted as a racist and a segregationist. There was one teacher who had named her dog Atticus and just was absolutely beside herself. But there are other teachers who say, look, this is a great learning opportunity. This is a chance to have a discussion about race relations with our students, and that's not an easy conversation to have. But one teacher said, if we don't have conversations like these, then we can't become the nation we want to be.
That's a good point. So we asked readers to submit their first impressions of Go Set a Watchman, and we asked them right after the first chapter, but people have been sort of adding as they go. So we'd like to just read some of those out loud. So Ken Carpenter wrote, "The tone, the style, the rhythm, the big words, and literary references feel a lot like To Kill a Mockingbird. My favorite sentence, which says a lot about the 26-year-old Scout," this is in quotes, "her favorite game was golf because its essential principles consisted of a stick, a small ball, and a state of mind." And then we had one from Cathy Gevlin, who said, "I was struck, at least by this chapter, by the lack of literary flair that is found in To Kill a Mockingbird. Set a Watchman is so clearly a draft, it seems to me. Miss Lee had not the opportunity to refine her language, which she did so gloriously in To Kill a Mockingbird. She says, in To Kill a Mockingbird, the suspense is set up in the first sentence, not so with a new novel." So what were your impressions? I mean, how would you compare the first chapter of To Kill a Mockingbird with the first chapter of Go Set a Watchman?
Well, first I have to say that the first chapter of To Kill a Mockingbird, it's so brilliant. If the first line, I just want to read it out loud because I think it's so perfect. When he was nearly 13, my brother Jem got his arm badly broken at the elbow. So from that first line in To Kill a Mockingbird, she tells us so much, and she sets up a story that will carry us through till the end of the novel, right? That's the point that we are heading towards. It's so perfectly constructed. It's just amazing. And in that first chapter, she vividly describes the town of Maycomb. She gives us a really keen sense of place. She introduces the characters. She sets the action in motion, and she does it so concisely. It's just such a perfect first chapter, and her voice is evident from the first words. This scout character who is so going to be our guide through this story, who has these sort of wry descriptions and comments, and her insight on the characters and events of Maycomb. She's funny, and at times, her narration is really moving. So that voice comes through loud and clear in the first chapter. Ghost of the Watchman is really different, and it struck me from the very beginning that the narrator's voice is very different because it's told in the third person. Yeah. And at first I found myself really missing Scout's voice because I love it so much. But it does have sort of glimmers of the voice that we find in To Kill a Mockingbird. The opening of Go Set a Watchman is slower. It takes a while for the action to get underway. And the way she dispatches her brother Jem in one sentence is sort of like shocking, and I was frankly pretty devastated. It was a kick to the gut. I mean,
yeah.
I think a lot of us felt, how could you do that, and how could you just write him off in a clause? But it was so fascinating to see her raw talent here, because remember, this is her very first attempt at writing a novel. This is the first manuscript she submits to a publisher, and it's unedited. I mean, when they published it this year, they put it through like copy edited. But essentially, this is her first attempt, and it's so fascinating to see how she first envisioned these characters, who ultimately evolved into the characters of To Kill a Mockingbird and who we know and love. But we know here in this first chapter that from the very start, she envisioned Scout as having been a tomboy in her childhood, and it's so amazing to see how Harper Lee envisioned her as a 26-year-old. She's sexually liberated. She's toying with the idea of having, a sexual relationship with her boyfriend. She is sort of chafing at the idea of marriage and the idea of sort of conforming to her small town's gender roles, being a wife and a mother. And that, I think, is really compelling and made me want to read more.
Yeah, you mentioned to me the other day about that scene where Scout is sitting with the other young women of her town. Can you just talk about that scene a little bit? It seems really interesting in terms of Scout's character development.
Yeah, so this is a chapter in Go Set a Watchman. She's returning home to her town in Alabama on vacation from New York, where she's been living and working. And there's a tradition in this town when a young woman comes back from living, in the big city, somebody holds a coffee party for her, and all the other young women her age come over to basically check out the one who's moved to the big city. So Aunt Alexandra holds a coffee party, and all these young women come over to the house, and she finds herself feeling really alienated, really sort of the odd one out. She doesn't have a lot to say to them. She doesn't know how to engage them in conversation, and so she's sort of overhearing the little clusters of women in their conversations about their new husbands, about their babies, and then there's the cluster of women who sort of haven't found husbands, and so they have jobs and they're talking about their work. But she doesn't fit in with any of them, and she really, I think, here is confronting this inner conflict. How could I get married? How could I be one of them? How could I be a wife and a mother? This doesn't feel like me. And I think that's so fascinating, and gives us insight into Harper Lee as an author, someone who never got married herself. I just think it's amazing to sort of peer inside her mind and to see how in the 50s she was grappling with these issues.
It's so fascinating. Okay, well, thank you so much, Jen. I think we'll wrap it up, but thanks for being here. And we just wanted to announce to book club members today that we're going to extend the conversation of Go Set a Watchman for the next couple weeks, and then we'll announce the new book and host in mid-August. So please check back on the Facebook page and participate in the discussion. There's a lot of great stuff there. And thank you so much for being here, Jen, and everyone who tuned in.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Bye.